Hi, I'm John, one of the pastors here. It's Palm Sunday, the beginning of Holy Week, and we see Jesus entering into Jerusalem amidst celebrations and crowds and adoring fans. But this happy scene soon ends in tears. Why? Because Jesus knows how it will all end. But he's crying for us, not for himself, as we will see as we dive into today's passage. But before going any deeper, I just have to say that I am not a big fan of royalty. For example, I've never understood the fascination with the British royal family. I didn't grow up caring much about Princess Di or the birth of Prince William or later on Prince Harry. I didn't pay much attention to the scandal surrounding Camilla, and I have no idea why Duchess Kate hasn't been seen in weeks. The only reason I even know anything about it is I like to listen to the BBC News so I can hear a perspective on the news from outside the United States. I've got nothing against Charles and Camilla or William and Kate or Harry and Meghan. They're really more like celebrities to me than anything else. They just don't seem relevant to my life. Beyond the irrelevance, I don't even like the idea of royalty. I'm practically allergic to the notion of someone having power over my life, especially if I don't think they earned it, and especially if I can't vote them out. What about you? Do you share my distrust of power, especially political power? Do you have an anti-authoritarian streak that runs through you as well? It's all well and good when a leader attacks the right problems, when a leader fights against the right enemies, or when a leader gets things done rather than allowing good ideas to die in endless and ineffectual committees. But power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, right? When has a leader ever handled unchecked power without turning to the dark side? Here in the U.S., we are a nation founded in rebellion. Many of our ancestors left other nations, often fleeing the violent abuses of authority that they experienced elsewhere. We have inherited a huge anti-authority streak accompanied by a huge helping of distrust. I think much of the political quagmire facing our nation right now is rooted in our distrust of authority and those in power, especially any power that represents the other side, whichever side that may be. And it's not just politics. Trust in institutions of all kinds have experienced a severe decline over the past few decades. According to Gallup, in just the past 2 years, trust in the military is down from 69 to 60%. Trust in banks is down from 33 to 26%. Trust in the church and organized religion is down from 37 to 32%. But at least we're doing better than Congress, which was already at an abysmal 12%, but somehow managed to sink to single digits at 8%. You probably don't even trust me right now. And even if you do, there's probably at least a part of you that's evaluating me, judging what I have to say. Maybe you're wondering if I can be trusted. You may be wondering if I have a hidden agenda. After all, I have the microphone. This is not an equal exchange. What right do I have to be the only one who speaks right now? With all the self-serving abuses of authority in our world, you have every right to be guarded. This caution and mutual suspicion is nothing new, but it makes life hard. So much of all that we do as human beings works only if we cooperate and trust one another. We need parents and teachers and mentors and coaches and leaders of all kinds. We have to allow some people to lead. We have to trust others with authority at some point. There's a constant tension between our need to trust and the reality of getting burned. And some of you have really been burned by those in authority. And into this messy world walks Jesus in today's passage. He's been building up quite a following, 12 close lieutenants that he calls apostles, along with maybe 200 committed followers, and occasional crowds of a few thousand. People are talking. He's shaking things up, which is why a lot of leaders don't like him, and maybe what makes the crowds like him even more. But people are starting to wonder, could he be something more? This poor peasant, this itinerant rabbi, could he be the one? the one who was promised, the Son of David, the Messiah, the returning King. The last king of Judah had been Zedekiah around 600 years earlier. Ever since then, the Jewish people had been waiting for a promised king, a descendant of David, to restore Israel. God had promised that King David and his house, his descendants, would sit on the throne forever. The people had been watching and waiting, reading the signs of the times, hoping for God to fulfill this legendary promise of a Messiah king. And this Jesus, he was from the tribe of Judah. He was a descendant of David. He had the right pedigree. And God seemed to be with him, and the people were following him more and more. Maybe, just maybe, he might be the promised king. That's what the people were wondering. And Jesus very intentionally validates their suspicions. He even gives them intentional signals that connected him with this ancient promise. Back when David was king, on the day that his son Solomon was installed as the new king in Israel, his father David had him ride in on a mule, not a horse. Jesus leans into that same royal imagery by having his disciples bring him a young donkey to ride into the city. Previously, Jesus had gone out of his way to steer clear of royal imagery. He intentionally avoided any titles like Messiah or King. He had even fled from the crowds that were attempting to make him king after the feeding of the 5,000. But Jesus now embraces this identity as king. Why? What is happening? Has power finally gone to his head? And the crowds immediately embrace this move by Jesus. By placing their cloaks on the ground beneath Jesus, they were recognizing him as king. Clothes were super expensive back then. There was no fast fashion. Clothes were so valuable that they were often part of an inheritance. All of this to say, lining a path with their cloaks was an act historically reserved for royalty. Jesus immediately left the scene the last time he caught even a whiff that the crowds wanted him to be king. But this time, Jesus embraces and even encourages the royal overtures. Why now? Has he gone mad? Has the adoration gone to his head? If the royal runway of cloaks wasn't enough, as Jesus approached closer to the city, the crowds began to shout, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord." No more cymbals and overtures. They were calling him king, out loud, in broad daylight. To declare any king other than Caesar was open treason. This celebration had become an act of rebellion. That phrase, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord," is a phrase from Psalm 118. Psalm 118 was the final part of the Hallel, a group of psalms that Jewish pilgrims would sing and chant as they approached Jerusalem. It was a phrase that they understood to be about the Messiah, and fresh in their minds, they applied it to Jesus. And Jesus just seems to take it in. The local religious leaders are understandably upset. They said to Jesus, "Rabbi, rebuke your disciples. They're out of control. They're going to start a riot or a rebellion. This is sacrilegious." I don't know, but I wonder if I had been there, maybe I would have sided with the Pharisees. It was getting out of control. They were welcoming Jesus as a new king. These are the kind of moments that blossom into spontaneous rebellions. It had happened before, and Rome always responded the same way, with overwhelming violence and cruelty. And do we really need another king? History is full of dark moments when we discover that the new boss is the same as the old boss. So how does Jesus respond? Does he tamp down on all this talk of kings and messiahs? Not at all. Instead, he embraces their praise. Jesus says that he won't tell his disciples to be quiet. He won't stop them from praising him. Instead, he replies, if they keep quiet, the very stones will cry out. In a world where power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, why does Jesus embrace identity as Messianic King? Has the lure of power corrupted him too? And if power corrupts Jesus, then what hope do we have? When I was a child, I was raised to have a high respect for authority. I was shocked at how other children spoke to adults, especially to their parents and teachers. But I also experienced the breakdown of that authority and trust. I was just 8 years old when President Nixon resigned in disgrace after the Watergate scandal. I heard about the lies that were uncovered in what the government told its citizens about the Vietnam War. By nature, I was a very trusting child. My parents told me that my honesty was one of my defining characteristics. I would tell the truth even when it would get me into trouble. I can remember being bewildered by the idea that trusted adults might lie to you, and not even for your own good, but to make things easier on themselves. By nature, I may have been trusting, but I was quickly learning that no one could be trusted. Trust was something that people in authority would use to lie to you, to take advantage of you. I prefer checks and balances, thank you. Trust but verify. Who watches the watchman? Jesus enters into their world and ours, coming as a king. And kings demand trust and obedience. Do any of us really want a king? There is so much going on in the scene. It's full of sights and sounds and conflict and history that it can be hard to make sense of it all. And you know what makes it even harder to understand? The very first line. After Jesus had said this, he went on ahead, going up to Jerusalem. This whole scene starts with after he had said this. After he had said what? Well, the whole previous passage. In other words, what Jesus is doing here is linked to what he said immediately before. We can't understand Palm Sunday without understanding the previous passage as well. So get ready for a double-length sermon. No, and after all that, I wouldn't want to violate your trust. Let me give you the TLDR version. Immediately before our passage today, Jesus told the story of a man who went off to have himself appointed king. But the people at home didn't want that man to be king. So of course, that returning king was angry when he came back, and he took vengeance upon those who had tried to undermine him. But those enemies of mine who did not want me to be king over them, bring them here and kill them in front of me. Those are the words that immediately precede our passage today. Those are the words referred to when our passage starts with, after Jesus had said this, he went on ahead, going up to Jerusalem. Quick question. When is a parable not a parable? Answer, when it's history. The story about a king actually happened, and the people back then knew all about it. There's a parable that Jesus embeds into that story, but the main story about a vengeful king actually happened. Facts. Remember the Christmas story? Remember when King Herod heard about Jesus? What did Herod do? He slaughtered all the boys 2 years old and younger, just in case there might have been a claim to the throne. Well, when that Herod died, Herod the Great, his eldest son Archelaus wanted to be king over Judea and Jerusalem. So Archelaus traveled all the way to Rome to petition Augustus Caesar. But the Jewish people thought that Archelaus was the worst of all of Herod's sons, so they went to Rome as well to petition Augustus Caesar to not make Archelaus king. But Rome granted Archelaus' request, and guess what? He acted as a tyrant and slaughtered many of those who had opposed him. In one rebellion, he put 3,000 people to death. So when Jesus told this preceding story about a murderous king, that part wasn't about the kingdom of God like in most parables. No, that was a statement about what kings do, and maybe even what kings have a right to do. Thank God we don't have kings, right? I think Jesus was agreeing with our distrust of kings. Who needs kings when their whim can mean the death of thousands? I believe Jesus told that story to set up his entrance to Jerusalem. Yes, Jesus was coming as a king, but such a different kind of king that it's almost painful to use that word. The very first thing that Jesus did was to get a donkey. And not just a donkey, but a young donkey that had never been ridden. I can tell you from firsthand experience, there is no way to ride a donkey that is dignified. When I was visiting Israel and Jordan, coming out of the city of Petra, our tour guide realized that we were running too late to catch the bus if we walked out of Petra. So he hired donkeys for us. We looked ridiculous. Donkeys have a mind of their own. And Jesus was riding a young donkey that had never been ridden. I've never broken in a donkey or a mule or a horse, but I'm told that they do not like to be ridden, especially the first time. I know that I looked ridiculous riding a donkey out of Petra. Jesus must have looked absolutely hilarious. And that's part of the point. The reason Jewish kings like Solomon had a royal tradition of riding donkeys or mules was that a horse was a symbol of war. A war horse was the ancient equivalent of riding on a main battle tank. It was something that a conquering king would do. But riding a donkey or a mule was a sign of peace and had become embedded into the prophecy about the promised Messiah as well. See, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. Jesus rides on a colt, the foal of a donkey, embracing not only the prophecy, but the symbolism that he comes in peace to teach and to heal, not to slay his opponents like a typical king, like a Herod or an Archelaus. And while kings like Herod or Caesar or Archelaus would demand that people serve them and pay them honor, that very week, on the day we call Maundy Thursday, Jesus would grab a towel and wash the feet of his disciples. Jesus would humble himself to serve as an example for us to follow as well. And while kings of this world might put their enemies to the sword, that very week, Jesus would tell Peter to put away his sword, for all who live by the sword will die by the sword. Instead of making others die for him, Jesus would die for us. The earlier story that Jesus told spoke about people who did not want a certain man to be installed as king. And like Archelaus, he took murderous revenge against those who opposed his kingship. Jesus faced a similar situation. The Pharisees didn't want Jesus as king. In fact, they later would join the priests in their plot to have Jesus killed. The Roman governor Pilate wouldn't want Jesus as king. His only king was Caesar. But Jesus knew that even the crowds wouldn't want Jesus as king. Yes, they called out to him, saying, "Blessed is the king," and laying their cloaks on the ground. But they wanted Jesus to be a king like other kings, a military conqueror, someone who would put their enemies to the sword. And that's why this scene ends the way it does. Jesus is not intoxicated by the adoration of the crowds. He isn't corrupted by the lure of power. Instead, this is how Jesus reacts. As he approached Jerusalem and saw the city, he wept over it and said, "If you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes." The crowds who were cheering his name, they wanted a king who would wield power as violence. They didn't want peace. In fact, those same crowds would later, just days later, call for Jesus' crucifixion in favor of Barabbas, someone who was all too willing to use violence against their enemies. Jesus came in on a donkey, a mount that symbolized peace, but they didn't want peace. They wanted power expressed in violence, and so Jesus wept, for he could see where that violence would lead, saying, "The days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment against you and encircle you and hem you in on every side. They will dash you to the ground, you and the children within your walls. They will not leave one stone on another, because you did not recognize the time of God's coming to you." One generation after Jesus, violent rebellion would lead to a Roman reprisal that would slaughter Jerusalem and destroy the temple, leaving only the Wailing Wall. A generation after that, Israel would be wiped off the map. All because we want our kings to be violent. We want our leaders to use power to intimidate, to cancel, or even crush our enemies. But that's not the kind of king Jesus came to be. And it's why he's the only king who deserves our trust. We are right to distrust power in those who seek it. But sometimes there are those who use power and position and authority not to serve themselves, but to serve others. When I go to my doctor, I show him things I wouldn't show just about anyone else. Why? Because I know he will use that power to heal me, not to hurt me. When I talk to the Highrock spiritual guides, I submit my honest and vulnerable self to them because I know that they are there for my good and that they too are submitted to King Jesus, the King of Peace. I get to speak to you right now, not because I have any right to power. In fact, this sermon itself is a result of collaboration and group editing with half a dozen other staff members. If this sermon is meaningful to you, they all deserve credit. And if you don't like it, it's really Pastor Taylor's fault or Pastor Dave's. It is only because we are submitted to one another and to God that any of us get to speak at all. Jesus steps into our world, earning our trust. He proves that he is worthy of honor and authority because even though he has the power and the right to demand obedience, like in Archelaus, instead he humbles himself, serves others, and lays down his life for the very people who would attack him. I still don't like the idea of royals and monarchs, but I'm ready to make an exception for Jesus, precisely because he is uniquely unlike any other king ever. Jesus entered not only into Jerusalem as a king on Palm Sunday, but he comes to us, to you, as a king, but not a conquering king, a servant king. A king who wants to use his power to bring peace to your life, to teach you to love your enemies, to do good to those who hate you, and to forgive and be forgiven. He comes to wash your feet, to wash you clean, and show you that you matter to God deeply, and to give you power, real power, not to crush your enemies, but to love them in such a way that enemies might even become friends. This is Holy Week. This is the week in which we celebrate and memorialize the many scenes in which Jesus displays just how different he is as a king. The servant king who washes feet, the king who cleanses the temple to protect a place for the outsider, a king who lays down his life for the very people who refuse to acknowledge him, forgiving his enemies even as they nail him to a cross. Please, take part in these services and celebrations so you can see for yourself why Jesus is the one and only person who truly deserves to be king. But for today, Jesus comes to you, riding on a miserable, stubborn little donkey. Let us join with the crowds in welcoming him. Let's greet Jesus the way they greeted him, but this time, truly understanding the words we are saying. All together, let's greet Jesus. Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Amen.